This one coming in from Azri. Schizophrenia says, Daniel, do you think it is just and righteous to prevent people from speaking against Islam, to conceal testimony what other people have? Is that what Allah stands for?
Yeah, so Islam restricts freedom of speech.
Great. Nice and simple. Islam restricts freedom of speech, and those restrictions aren't based on logic, ethics, or what is best for society. They're based purely on religious dogma. So the obvious question is, why would non-Muslims want to live under religious restrictions they don't even believe in? Now, of course, every society has limits on speech. We prohibit incitement to violence. We ban defamation and false advertising. But there's a critical difference. These restrictions make rational sense. They protect people from harm and uphold the integrity of public discourse. They're rooted in legal reasoning, ethics, and yes, in some cases, historical religious influence. But even if you removed religion from the equation entirely, these rules would still stand. Islamic speech restrictions, by contrast, only make sense within Islam. They are theologically motivated, not ethically reasoned. They don't make sense to people who aren't Muslim, and they shouldn't have to. So when preachers and activists call for Islamic blasphemy laws or speech codes in Western countries, what they're really doing is demanding that non-Muslims surrender their rights based on the commands of a 7th-century Arabian warlord, Muhammad, an illiterate caravan robber turned religious leader. Non-Muslims don't want that. We don't want to be told that criticizing a religion is illegal because someone's prophet claimed divine authority. We don't want Muhammad, a man we regard as a false prophet, deciding what we're allowed to say. If we're going to restrict speech, it will be through logic, law, and ethics, not religious decree. Religion can and should be part of the broader moral discussion, but we're not going to design our legal system around a religion that most of us reject, and certainly not around Islam, which demands submission, not reason.
And this is something that all cultures and societies restrict, freedom of speech. And you can read the book by Stanley Fish. He's a philosopher that says there's no such thing as free speech, and it's a good thing too. And the idea is that to maintain social cohesion and social order, you have to have certain speech norms, and you have to limit speech in order to maintain those kinds of bonds and social cohesion. Otherwise, you're going to have chaos and destruction.
Yes, Stanley Fish wrote a book in 1994 titled, There's No Such Thing as Free Speech, and it's a good thing too. But let's clear up a few things. First, Fish is not a philosopher, despite what this preacher claims. He's a literary theorist and legal scholar. And interestingly, he's Jewish, which makes it quite ironic that this anti-Semitic preacher is quoting him. As always, apologists cherry-pick. They find one quote or source that seems to support their agenda and ignore the broader context. Fish also claimed that there's no such thing as liberalism, which is amusing given how often this same preacher complains about liberalism. Now, it's true that accepting one idea from an author doesn't mean endorsing everything they say, but that's not what's happening here. These apologists aren't engaging in open inquiry. They're using selective quotes as tools to reinforce a worldview they already believe. They aren't following the evidence wherever it leads. They're scavenging for anything that can be reinterpreted to serve Islam. And there's another layer of irony. Fish published an entire book arguing free speech doesn't exist, while enjoying total free speech to do so. He's given lectures, interviews, and podcasts on this topic. So, to say, there's no such thing as free speech, while openly enjoying and exercising it, is intellectual clickbait. And based on the clickbait title alone, many of his critics, rightly, accuse him of sophistry. Of course, freedom of speech exists. Virtually no one claims it's absolute, meaning that you can say anything without any consequence. That's a straw man. The principle of free speech has always existed within a framework of reasonable limits. And the key word here is reasonable. Let's refer to real sources, like Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. And the General Comment Number 34 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, ICCPR, states, freedom of opinion and freedom of expression are indispensable conditions for the full development of the person. They are essential for any society. They constitute the foundation stone for every free and democratic society. The two freedoms are closely related, with freedom of expression providing the vehicle for the exchange and development of opinions. It further explains that this includes even offensive or deeply unpopular opinions, including political discourse, artistic expression, religious criticism, and journalism. And here comes the crucial point. Prohibitions of displays of lack of respect for a religion or other belief system, including blasphemy laws, are incompatible with the covenant. That's right. Under international human rights law, blasphemy laws are not compatible with human rights, except under very narrow conditions. It is impermissible to protect one religion over another, punish criticism of religious leaders or doctrine, discriminate against non-believers. Islam does all of these things. That's why it is incompatible with universal human rights. Now, the general comment acknowledges that freedom of expression does come with responsibilities. Paragraph 3 allows restrictions, but only to protect the rights of others, national security, or public order, or of public health or morals, but it clearly warns. However, when a state party imposes restrictions on the exercise of freedom of expression, these may not put in jeopardy the right itself. And perhaps most importantly, states parties should put in place effective measures to protect against attacks aimed at silencing those exercising their right to freedom of expression. Paragraph 3 may never be invoked as a justification for the muzzling of any advocacy of multi-party democracy, democratic tenets, and human rights. Nor, under any circumstance, can an attack on a person, because of the exercise of his or her freedom of opinion or expression, including such forms of attack as arbitrary arrest, torture, threats to life, and killing, be compatible with Article 19. This includes journalists, human rights activists, and critics of religion. The state has a duty to protect them, and yet, governments still allow radicals who justify violence for speech to enter their countries, in the name of tolerance and equality. This is suicidal tolerance and a violation of government human rights obligations to protect their citizens. But the main point remains. Public order is not a blank check to criminalize criticism or enforce religious orthodoxy. You cannot kill or silence people for criticizing religion and then claim it's about maintaining order. Islam does justify silencing dissent, including through violence, and we reject that completely. We don't believe in Islam, and we don't want laws based on Islam. If speech is to be restricted, it will be on logical, ethical, and legal grounds, not on the authority of a prophet we do not accept.
And so all societies prohibit speech, and liberal societies and modern liberal human rights governments in the West are the most restrictive when it comes to speech.
Liberal societies are the most restrictive when it comes to speech. Are you freaking kidding me? Take a look at the countries consistently ranked highest for freedom of speech and expression. They're all liberal democracies: Denmark, New Zealand, Ireland, Switzerland, Finland, and others. And you'll notice something else. Not a single one is a Muslim-majority country. Yes, these liberal nations have restrictions, perhaps even too many in some cases. But they are nothing compared to the censorship and repression in the Muslim world. In many Islamic countries, Christians aren't even allowed to proselytize. That's not just a speech restriction. That's a ban on religious freedom. And most of these countries still enforce blasphemy laws, criminalizing any criticism or mockery of Islam, a religion many of us rightly regard as false. And it gets worse. These laws aren't just domestic. Islamic leaders and preachers want to export them globally. They want non-Muslims around the world to be punished for insulting and exposing the falsehood of Islam. That's the agenda. So for this Muslim preacher to complain about speech restrictions in liberal democracies is beyond hypocritical. Liberal societies allow far more freedom than any Islamic regime on earth, including the freedom to criticize religion.
Because they literally assassinate and have a history of assassinating people throughout the world that have spoken out against liberalism, against democracy. Look at the assassination of civil rights leaders in American history who were arguing for racial acceptance, such as Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. They were assassinated by the deep state because of their opposition to the secular world order and the racist neo-colonial world order. So this is something that all the thing about liberal. Wait, let me answer the question. You're not getting any questions. You don't get to interrogate me along with Apus and all of these atheists. So let me just talk about deep state historical facts about the assassination of Martin Luther King, Malcolm X.
So because Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X were assassinated, we're supposed to believe there's no free speech in the West? That's the argument? That because these two men were assassinated by the deep state, allegedly, freedom of speech doesn't exist? Even if that conspiracy theory were true, which it's not, MLK was assassinated in 1968. Why are we reaching back over 50 years to make a point about today? If the so-called deep state were constantly silencing dissent, shouldn't there be a recent example? From last week, last month, or even last year? Why the desperate reliance on half-century-old events? And by the way, what's the evidence that these assassinations were carried out by the deep state? If this alleged deep state was so powerful, why didn't it stop these figures from becoming famous in the first place? Their influence, writings, and speeches have only grown since their deaths. None of this supports the claim that free speech doesn't exist in liberal democracies. In fact, the opposite is true. Their legacies prove how powerful speech can be, and how it can outlive any bullets.
And look at the colonial period, where you have Britain, you have France, you have the Netherlands, who are controlling colonies, and they are stamping out with brutal authority any opposition to colonial rule. They have to do this. Okay, they have to do this, otherwise liberalism won't be accepted.
Why is he talking about British colonial rule? What does that have to do with the present? Why not talk about how society functions now? Is it because it would not support his claims? And another point that can be mentioned. Muslims speak negatively about colonialism while following a religion that openly commands religious imperialism, as clearly stated in Surah 929. Islam itself was spread through military conquest and religious domination for centuries. You don't get to complain about colonialism while defending a belief system that explicitly promotes it.
So this is the free speech of liberalism and human rights.
How insane is it that this man is using the free speech that liberalism grants him to argue for taking away that very right from others? He's been given the gift of free speech, and he's using it to advocate for Sharia law, which would eliminate this incredible concept altogether. And how absurd are Western countries that welcome people who openly declare they want to strip away the rights of native citizens? They say it plainly. They want to outlaw criticism of Islam. They admit Islam is not compatible with human rights. So why on earth would you let large numbers of people with this ideology into your country? What does Islam actually teach about free speech? Let's look at some sources. Of course, not all Muslims believe in or even know these texts, but Islamists do, and they want to enforce them, not just for themselves, but for everyone. If you care about protecting human rights, you should stand against this. Quran 5:33 says, "Indeed, the penalty for those who wage war against Allah and His Messenger and strive upon earth to cause corruption is none but that they be killed or crucified, or that their hands and feet be cut off from opposite sides, or that they be exiled from the land. That is for them a disgrace in this world, and for them in the hereafter is a great punishment. Ah yes, the peaceful and tolerant religion calling for crucifixion and mutilation." Lovely. And if you say, that's not what the verse means, then I guess the top Muslim scholars who translated and explained it all got it wrong? If they can't understand it, who can? That would make the Quran a useless book, unclear, confusing, and unfit to follow. So what exactly does it mean to wage war against Allah and His Messenger and cause corruption? You'd think that when life and death are on the line, the Quran would be crystal clear. But it isn't. It leaves the terms deliberately vague, opening the door to dangerous interpretations. Apologists will argue that because the verse before this condemns murder, the punishment in 533 must also apply to murderers. But if that were the intent, why not say it directly? Why the cryptic phrasing about corruption and waging war? And let's be honest, if someone were constantly mocking Muhammad, criticizing Islam, or insulting the Quran, would you not interpret that as waging a verbal war against Islam? I would, if I were a Muslim, because the verse mentions war against Allah, who cannot be attacked physically, so this must include spiritual or verbal opposition too. Now look at this quote from islamqa.info, quoting Ibn Taymiyyah. Muharaba, waging war against Islam, is of two types, physical and verbal. Waging war verbally against Islam may be worse than waging war physically, as stated above. Hence the Prophet, peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, used to kill those who waged war against Islam verbally, whilst letting off some of those who waged war against Islam physically. This ruling is to be applied more strictly after the death of the Prophet, peace and blessings of Allah be upon him. Mischief may be caused by physical action or by words, but the damage caused by words is many times greater than that caused by physical action. And the goodness achieved by words in reforming may be many times greater than that achieved by physical action. It is proven that waging war against Allah and His Messenger, peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, verbally is worse, and the efforts on earth to undermine religion by verbal means is more effective. I've seen this quote repeated on several mainstream Muslim websites, and the respected scholar Raymond Ibrahim has cited it as well. This continues to be taught in modern Islamic thought. This isn't a fringe opinion. It reflects a well-established view in Sunni Islam, even though not all Muslims believe it or even know about it. But it's the Islamists, the ones pushing for global enforcement of Sharia, who do know these sources, and they're the ones trying to impose them on everyone else. Let's consider what this quote admits. It plainly acknowledges that Muhammad ordered the execution of individuals purely for verbal criticism, not physical attacks. These weren't self-defense killings. These were responses to speech. And that tells you everything you need to know about Islam's stance on free speech. The Prophet of Islam did not believe people had the right to publicly criticize him. According to this tradition, speech alone could warrant death. So tell me again how Islam values freedom of expression. The quote even argues that words are more dangerous than physical violence, which echoes the old saying, "The pen is mightier than the sword." And ironically, I agree. Words are powerful, critique is powerful, and Islam is terrified of critique. That's why it demands blasphemy laws. That's why it punishes dissent. Because it is fragile, so fragile it cannot withstand even verbal challenge, and this fragility exposes it. But here's the key difference. We don't respond with violence. We respond with words. We counter Islamic fundamentalism through education, exposure, and honest analysis, not brutality. Because the goal is de-radicalization, not destruction. And that's why Islamists are afraid. Because open critique is winning. It's undermining their dogma. It's waking people up. And as long as we keep speaking freely, we will continue promoting a better, more ethical, and more meaningful vision of God and religion. One that can actually stand up to scrutiny. There are many more examples of how Islam suppresses free speech, but we'll leave those for another time. Thanks for listening. Please like, subscribe, comment, and share, and visit my website Radical Universe to become a member and learn more. Thanks again.